So we're at the end of this series, and I want to play a little bit today, and I hope you'll play along this morning as well. If you came and you don't want to play, you picked a bad day to be here, but I think you'll get something out of this. I don't know how many of you read the blog that finally came out. I got it to everybody late, and it finally got out, and it was like 5 or 6 o'clock when it came out yesterday. So some of you have told me that you read the blog. I'm going to repeat a story that I wrote in the blog because it illustrates so much where I want to go this morning. And I think some of you will be able to identify with this. As a child, I had an anger issue. I still have a little bit of an anger issue now, to be honest with you. But back then, it was uncontrolled. It was unrestricted. And sometimes it would find its way to a hole in the wall, or sometimes it might find its way to, if you recall, a broken ukulele that got smashed on a 4th grade floor in a classroom after my uncle gave it to me for Christmas. And that was a whole thing about wanting a guitar instead. But in this occasion, I was standing in front of a 3-foot wall in our backyard, and I was looking out of the flower bed, and I had set some clay pots. And the reason why I was there with these clay pots set on that 3-foot wall was because I had had a particularly Alexander-type day. A no good, very bad, terrible, horrible day. My teacher had been on my back. I'd frustrated her to no end. My homework hadn't been turned in. I had kids who had turned on me that I thought were my friends. I had acne that had shown up that morning. And on the way home, my bike had a flat tire. So I'm walking my bike home, and by the time I'm halfway home, I'm at a certain level of anger. Now, if you sort of figure that there's a measurement of anger where 1 or 2 is sort of like your remote doesn't work, so you have to get up and go change the channel, versus 95, which is you're ready to destroy anything or anyone, except you're kind of concerned that you don't get caught at it. I was a 98, and I had already forgotten about the whole thing about being caught. When I got in the house, I just wanted to destroy something, but I at least had my presence of mind that I walked past my grandmother's china and some of the more family heirlooms that were here and there in the dining room, and then some of the fancy stuff that was in the kitchen, and I went straight to the backyard because that's where I saw the perfect objects for my wrath, these clay pots. My mom used them for her therapy every Saturday morning after working all week. She would go out and work in the garden, and she would plant plants and such. And these clay pots, to my good fortune, had descending order in them. They were large to small, and I lined them up in such an order. Turned them upside down because I had gotten the idea as I saw them out there and grabbed a hammer from the kitchen that when I went outside, this idea came to me that if I smashed them in just the right way with the hammer, it might be interesting to see what they did. You might not realize this, but the bottom of those clay pots is thinner than the rest of the clay pot. If you hit it just right, you could probably knock out the middle of it. It became a science experiment. I was pretty proud of myself at that morning. Thought my teacher might be glad to know my personal experiment. But of course, the wrath had kind of gotten hold of me, and I began smashing these clay pots. And I smashed the first one, and it broke into a dozen pieces. My theory was ruined. And I smashed the second one, and as I got to the smaller pots, they tended to break in every direction. And after a while, it was just random, and it was feeling good, and it was cathartic. And I was getting down to the last couple of them when I raised up the hammer, looked to my right, and my uncle was standing at the door. Now, my Uncle Mac lived down the street from us, and my Uncle Mac worked for himself. Nobody else was home, but we have a big picture window that was in the back of the den, and apparently he'd been standing there the whole time watching me. So I have my hammer up in the air, and my uncle looks at me, and he says, "Tommy, what are you doing?" And I answer the way that any good teenager would answer such a universal question, with the perfect answer, and said, "Nothing." And then he asked me the second question, which makes perfectly logical sense, and says, "Why are you smashing the clay pots?" To which I responded with the second perfectly teenage response to all universal questions, which is, "I don't know." And then he approached me, and my uncle has a bit of he's no longer living, he passed away this past year, but he has a foreboding presence about him, a large sort of shape and face that just sort of pierces into you, and he started to approach me with those piercing eyes, and my hammer fell to my side, and I backed up a step. And he said, how would you like to make money destroying things? And my first thought was, is this a trick question? But he didn't say another word to me. I just looked at him stunned. He put the hammer down, moved the clay pots out of the way, kind of into a trash can there, except for the ones that weren't broken, and then took me to his pickup and started driving. And I thought, I still don't know what he's talking about. I don't know what he's up to, and I'm kind of getting a little bit anxious because my uncle doesn't have children. He's never taken me out to the woods and left me out there, but that was running through my mind. But instead, he turned down a street that went over to the east side of Fort Worth where he had a laundromat. In fact, my uncle had 2 laundromats. And that day, my uncle gave me my first real job. I got paid to tear apart the broken washing machines and to salvage whatever parts I could. My uncle had 2 boxes that he'd set aside, which I always thought were funny. To this day, I still think about them metaphorically for some reason. I don't know what he meant by them. But one box was useful things. So any hoses that worked or any motors that seemed intact, that went in useful things. And then he had this other box which said less useful things. But it didn't say trash. He said, you never know what I might do with it. So I just put the less useful things that seemed like they weren't repairable into that box. And I worked for him for several weeks on weekdays after school and on the weekends. And then after about several weeks of working, of course, I'd forgotten all about the clay pots until my uncle was driving me home one day and then looked at me and talked about it for just a moment and said, you've been enjoying the job? I said, yeah, it's been cool. I mean, I get dirty, I get slimy, I get to break things, and I get paid. And he said, what could you do with that money? And I was thinking, well, there's a lot of things I could do. And then he gave me that piercing look again. And I didn't even have to think about it at that point. I said, I could quickly go and get some more clay pots to replace the ones I broke. Now, I've shared in here before that my uncle had this way of seeing things. He used to take us out hunting, and when we'd go hunting and looking for animal in the woods and out in the wildlife, he'd always say, you're not seeing it, and we'd look, and he'd say, it's right there, it's a buck, a 10-point buck, and we'd say, I don't see anything, or he'd say, there's pheasants over there, and we'd say, I don't see anything, and then he'd look at us and say, you're looking too hard, and we'd go, well, how can you do that? And then he'd teach us how to just look around and to be patient and just to look. Stop expecting where you think it is. It will show up where you don't think it is. And how we learn to see because of that metaphorically. And I like to think, even though I don't think of my uncle as thinking of himself as some great Zen sensei, I like to think of my uncle as having taught me a couple of things, even unintentionally. And it's that playful way. In fact, if you were to pinpoint him in terms of his personality, he was more of a trickster than a master or a sensei. But a trickster, by very nature, is all about improvisation. It's all about surviving and making sense of chaos by using whatever wits you have and whatever resources you can muster up with your imagination. And that's a lot of who my uncle was. And I think there's something to that in our understanding of who Jesus is, who Jesus was. Someone who often came into the reality around him with this new idea that wasn't so new, but it seemed new to where the empire was at that time, to where the ruling sort of Jewish religious ruling thinking was at that time. He came in and reframed it. I told you the Good Samaritan story last week, which was not so much about just being good, but was the fact that it was a Samaritan that Jesus used to illustrate who's in God's kingdom. The enemy, the ones you don't like, are the ones God's choosing. Jesus turned things upside down the way a trickster would come in and say, sometimes you just got to shake it up because otherwise you may never see it. That was like my uncle. Now, the fun thing about improvisation, which we're going to play around a little bit with this morning, is that improvisation is about shaking things up. But more than that, it's also about being present. And I think my uncle had the presence of mind to look at me and see, instead of a troubled kid who was breaking things, who was breaking rules, who was doing something wrong, he saw a kid who probably wasn't that different from himself when he was a kid, who's not that different from most kids, in fact, not that different from many adults, who simply just lose it. So how can we deal with that? Well, instead of confronting, He simply took and worked with it and ran with it. Now, that's a lot like improvisation, but he had the presence to do so. He had the presence of mind, the attentiveness to do so. So, I'm going to suggest that one of the ways in which we learn how to see God in our midst, one of the ways in which we learn how to experience the burning bushes, one of the ways in which we learn to see with eyes that see and hear with ears that actually hear, is to practice a little improvisation. The reality is that you do it all the time anyway. I mean, we all improvise. We have to figure out how we're going to deal with a work situation. We have to figure out how we're going to get to a new place that we haven't been to. We have to cook dinners, and we get all improvisational. Last night, my wife made this amazing chicken tortilla soup, and I said, "What's in it?" And she said, "I really don't know." And I said, "Well, don't you have a recipe?" She said, "Well, it said chicken and rice." And then it kind of got all messed up because it was all stained, so I just started adding things. Sometimes we improvise with all sorts of things in our lives. So I want us to kind of play around with this idea of improvisation. And I was reading a book that I've read it over the years, and it's one of my favorite books. My own personal reason, by the way, my own personal bias for this desire to kind of explore improvisation a little bit is because I took two improvisation classes last year with the 4-day weekend group, which a lot of you have probably been to 4-day weekends. Great improvisational group. And they offer these classes. And so I took these classes. The very first class that I took came off of a Groupon, which was kind of interesting. It was right before Christmas. And I put on there, on the Groupon account, put it in the wish list kind of thing, like, I'm going to get this. And then I decided to go ahead and get it. Well, when I got to Christmas, I opened up a present underneath the tree from my wife Linda, and it said, "I've got you a class, a class at Improv 4-day weekend. I bought you the class for the opening first level class." And I looked at it and I said, "Oh my gosh, that's great, but I already got it for myself." And she said, no, I got it for you. And I said, no, I already got it for myself. Well, I realized what happened is she got online because she decided she wanted to get it to me, saw the Groupon, thought she had already ordered it. So I didn't get anything for Christmas from my wife that year because I had already paid for it. But the fun thing was the fact that she thought I would enjoy it, and in fact I did. So here's what this wonderful writer, Patricia Madsen, writes about improvisation that I want to speak with you just for a little bit about and get you to go do a few things yourself. A good improviser, she says, is someone who is awake, not entirely self-focused, and moved by a desire to do something useful and give something useful back. I'm going to read it one more time just so you get those characteristics. A good improviser is someone who is awake, not entirely self-focused, and moved by a desire to do something useful and give something back. Is she talking about a disciple of Christ, or is she talking about an improviser? Awake, not entirely self-focused, and wanting to give something back. So, the foundation, how to be awake. In improvisation, the hardest thing for me to do, and that's why I've got two friends here who are going to do it for me, is that I am terrified of chaos. And improvisation is all about letting go. It's all about being present. And so I have two brave souls who have no hesitancy whatsoever to look ridiculous in public. Me, I've got all the definitions, I've got all the attributions and all the judgments already in my head, and I still can't let go after 2 semesters with this group. So I'm going to invite Jakey Cabe and Chuck Chandler to come up. Chuck's just now taking a class this semester, so we're glad that he's excited to help out. Now, they're just going to do a couple examples of something, and then we're going to do an exercise together, not this particular one. But one of the things about improv is this idea you have to let go. You heard, as Penny was reading from the scripture text from Matthew, this wonderful passage where Jesus has just told the parable of the sower, and they say, "Why do you speak in parables?" And he says it's because it speaks to the Old Testament. It fulfills the saying in the Old Testament, "They no longer see because their eyes have grown dull. They no longer hear because their ears have been blocked up." We know what it's like to go from day to day and no longer really be engaged. The very fact that 70% of our population didn't vote this last time, I mean, we're apathetic. It's a reality we no longer really hear or really see because the same old thing continues to happen and it just becomes frustrating. Improv is about somehow learning how to engage by being present and letting go of all of those presuppositions. So they have these weird games, these weird interesting activities to mess with your mind. This one is called What Am I Doing?
Tom gave you the example of what good improv looks like. You got us. So yeah. Just have to bear with us. So in this game, I'm going to start doing an activity, and it's called object where you create your universe. I imagine I'm doing this thing, and so what are you doing? I'm raking the leaves. What are you doing?
I'm brushing my dog's teeth. What are you doing?
I'm sawing this log. What are you doing?
I'm erasing all of my Facebook contacts. What are you doing?
What are you doing?
I'm thinking about world peace.
And see.
Are you?
A couple of things real quick, too. You could see, now what happens in this activity when we do this in class is that it moves faster and faster and faster, and it becomes totally second nature to be able to see one thing and do another thing simultaneously, which is part of the challenge, again, in paying attention, focusing. So this is just one of those exercises. Now, I want to get to one of the foundational rules of improvisation that we'd like for you to participate in, but we'll let them do an example first. One of the primary sort of givens in improv, and again, as I'm speaking to you, I want to encourage you, because of our time, I want to encourage you to be thinking, how is this speak to spirituality? How does this speak to my spiritual practice, to my being a disciple, to my practicing what it means to be light and love in the world? How does this fit? I think you'll be able to see the immediate connection. But the one foundational sort of presupposition that goes with all improvisation that you can't get to without it is this awareness, this being attentive. The second part is accepting. You have to accept. If you're not willing to accept what's given to you, then it's going to shut down. So they have a rule that's called accept and agree. And we'll talk about that in just a minute, what that means. But in order to agree and accept, you have to do some practice. So they have a little game called yes and. One of the things we're probably most familiar with, we've probably even heard it maybe even in our business settings before. We use it a lot as a metaphor. It's a little harder to put into practice in a general way. But yes and is sort of the game. So they're going to give you some examples of yes and also yes but.
So somebody give me a location. Give us a where we are. Church. Oh, we're in church.
That's gonna be
perfect, okay? That's a stretch, but it's a good choice. It's a high percentage choice. That's good.
Yeah. Relationship?
I can't believe you made me late for church today.
Yes, and I'm repentant of that. I'm very sorry.
And you should be.
Yes, and you feel very defiant on that point, I see.
Yes, well, I think it has to do with the fact that every week I'm waiting.
Yes, and I asked my therapist about that this week.
Yes? Well, and I'm really glad you're in therapy. I mean,
Part of the
there's always a person on the side that's supposed to have really great timing of when to pull the scene at just the right moment, which I didn't. But at any rate,
The highest point of comedy.
that's right. That's right. Who's that guy? So that was a great example of yes and at work, because already you could see there was a relationship established, and already you could see where it was moving things forward. So now we're going to have an example of where what happens in improvisation is called negation, something at which for the 2 semesters of improv I remain very good at doing.
I need a little oil can like the Tin Man, Rusty.
Somebody give us another location. Thanksgiving Day meal.
Wow.
Here we go.
Okay. Before I carve this turkey, would anyone like to say something they're thankful for?
I don't think that you've given us much to be thankful for, Dad.
Okay, son. Is there something you want to say to the whole table? I mean, Mom's right there.
Not really. I mean, no. I don't think you've given us much.
Well, yes. I can see that you think that way.
So now it's my thinking. Now it's my thinking that's wrong.
No, I think it's your ungratefulness.
Well, I'm sprung from your loins.
Are you naked right?
Okay, and scene. All right. Now, just make sure we stop this at the right time here. Now,
So let me go into a fight scene.
yeah. Now, just what, and that was awesome too, because that was a very vague sort of almost gray area of negation, because you still ran with it.
I did.
You were doing advanced improv, which was you just keep running with whatever is given to you.
Oh yeah, I forgot to stop it.
So now just illustrate in black and white, just as concrete as possible, an example of yes but or yes no.
No but.
No but.
No maybe. Another location?
Sure.
Or relation?
A Kiss concert.
Our Kiss concert.
Okay.
But maybe the band hasn't started yet.
Yeah, right, because I can't hear anything.
Or that's the negation. Maybe that's it. It's like,
What are you saying?
no!
What?
No!
What?
And scene? No. Okay, Kiss concert.
You paid $40 a piece for these tickets?
I didn't pay $40. Are you stupid? I would never pay $40 for Kiss.
No, I'm not stupid.
Are you sure about that?
No.
No, you're not sure? You're not sure? How much did you pay? You paid $40?
No, I got them for free.
You got them for free.
Yeah?
Man, I want to hang out with you.
No.
Okay, and see. All right. Now,
Actually, we didn't kill it.
We didn't. We still.
yeah, I tell you, I should have
Wanna
gotten really
play.
bad improvisers to do this, because they keep running with whatever's given to them. So here, I'm just going to give you a quick example, because I am so good at negation.
Okay,
I'm going to give you an example. So Jake, you just throw something at me. We're opening a scene.
Hey, I got these new pants for Mom for Christmas. You want to make them for both of us?
Oh, no. Those are for Dad.
No, they're not. They're for Mom.
No, I didn't want to go get Mom pants. I got them for Dad.
No, but look at them. They're girls.
Kids, I'm your father, and I've come to say I'm going to have an operation.
And scene. I knew we were in transition.
Now, just to give you a heads up here, because we got to move along, but that's what you call pimping the scene.
Pimping the scene.
So basically what it means is you go for the joke at the expense of one of the other players.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, he wasn't dying quick enough.
Yes,
All right, so here's what I want you to do real quickly. So negation is, you experience it all the time. You experience it in staff meetings. You experience it in relationships. You experience it in the cliched sort of pre-adolescent who says, I don't want to do that. We're going to the movie. I don't want to go. You know, so negation in improv is always someone says, I walk up to the window. So I walked up the window, and I'm about to write you a ticket, and then the person looks up and says, why are you at the grocery store? And again, it makes no sense, but in your mind, you started out with something else, and you can't let go of whatever you started with. And so it negates what the other person offered. The most obvious example is to say, well, I want to go eat at Jack in the Box. And the other person would say, no, I don't want to. And the first person keeps saying, well, it's really good. It's fast food. It's good. No, I don't like fast food. But it's cheap. Nah, I'd rather spend more money. I mean, so that's an example of yes, but, or no, and. Obviously, to take it further, to take it yes, and then you simply go with what's given, and you just see how far it will go. So here's what I want you to do. We're only going to take this for a couple of minutes because we are over time, but I want us to at least experience a little improv together. Turn to one person, someone you didn't come with probably would be even better, but just turn to someone and decide who's going to be the no and who's going to be the first person. And just start by saying a scene, by just saying a suggestion, I'd like to do, or how about we do this, or I'm standing in front of a, and then the other person can negate it. Do that a couple of times just to see how that feels. Okay, now stop. Scene. Now try it with the yes and. And again, because we're crowded in here, you really got to focus your attention. But now try it with the yes and. One of you decide and just start with, so I'm thinking about, or however you want to start a scene, and then the other person respond. Keep in mind there are two things that improvisers like to do that apply to, I think, how we live our lives in faithful response to God's kingdom, and that is that we try to make the other person look good. In improv, you always try to make the other actor look good. You're both doing it for each other. You don't want to give somebody something that shuts it down, so you always try to offer something that moves it forward. We call that in theology creating with God. So try that now, yes and. I think we're going to. Okay, and scene. So here's some thoughts very quickly before we wrap things up. Yeah, before we wrap things up, here's a couple of quick thoughts. Improv is about bringing something to life. It's about yes and, it's about co-creating. In our text today, we see Moses who notices the burning bush, and here's God in the midst of all of that. And then, and then responds to it, but unwillingly at first. And then God says, you have to tell them that I am. If you look at the Hebrew, what it really says is, I will be who I will be. There's this idea that when God sees a calamity, or when there's oppression, or when there is crisis, God is present, something gets done. God motivates, God inspires. Now, a lot of different views that we have on how God acts in the world, and I don't want to get too much theologically into that. What I want to suggest is that when you start thinking of Thanksgiving and you start thinking of grace and gratitude in this season, it occurred to me that the one thing we often don't refer to in our theological creeds, but we often refer to when we talk about our faith experience, is this idea of grace. And it's one of the things that we don't think about with improvisation, but it's clearly there. In order for it to move forward, grace has to be present. There has to be a willingness to be present with one another. There has to be a willingness to see what you didn't see before, and maybe realize that maybe, as G.K. Chesterton said in our part 1 of this thing, maybe what's wrong is I am. You have to be willing. Grace is about humility and openness and authenticity. It's bringing who you are, but always being open to change if that's required. So what I want to suggest this season, when you start thinking about Advent, but especially as we start moving towards Thanksgiving and we move and get with our families, because it's a time for families. It's a time for challenges. It's a time of joy. It's a time of sadness. It's a time of mixed emotions. It's a great time to improvise. It's a great time to be present to just what is and think to yourself, maybe I'm not seeing the whole picture, but if I start opening with that position, maybe I'm not seeing it all. What else is here? Then maybe we can join in with the next step, which is the yes and see where that takes us. Some people will say, I know exactly what grace feels like. Anne Lamott has a great book that she came out with a couple years ago, and in that book she talks about, I know exactly what grace feels like. I don't know exactly where it is from time to time, but I know what it felt like. I think sometimes we can experience grace when we take the leap, when we bring to the table an openness to be the ones that might be seeing it wrong. Not everybody's going to play with us. That's one of the rules of improv. Everybody plays. Not everybody's going to play with us. Not everybody in the family, certainly not anybody in politics. Not everybody's going to play. But like Gandhi, somebody has to be willing to start the change. Somebody has to be willing to at least imitate and witness to the ground rules of what it might mean to be present and to respond with grace and with gratitude. And that's what I think is the end. Because you see, it's like the end and the beginning. They're both the same. In the end, if we've asked the question honestly enough, what's wrong with the world, and we're willing to come to the table and say, maybe it's all about how I see things, then we've already got the answer. What's right with the world? What's the answer? I am, and we are. Amen.